Right, so this morning the Grenfell Inquiry was finally concluded, with the final verdict finally having been published 7 years after the disaster which saw Grenfell Tower in Kensington engulfed in flames thanks to flammable cladding, which saw 72 lives lost. The investigation has been so wide-ranging and thorough in its investigation of how this disaster happened and who was at fault that it has taken this long to deliver upon, and has ended up running to nearly 1,700 pages, divided up into 14 parts in order to cover every aspect of what has amounted to a decades in the making culmination of failure, from the top to the bottom of the construction chain, from the top of national government to local government. Blame cannot be apportioned to just one source, for there are, sadly, many sources. Who is most at fault might be the question many people want answered, but it is neither that simple nor within the remit of the inquiry to actually decide that. That's for the judicial system to take forwards from this point. But now that the matter of fault has been formally established, those responsible must absolutely now face justice. Right, so at long last it seems the Grenfell Inquiry has concluded with a mammoth report whose size alone gives an indication of the breadth of systemic failure shown by multiple organisations, from the legislation governing the cladding used on the tower, inadequate as it was known to be, to those who recommended that cladding, not knowing for sure, not caring either, frankly, if it was safe to use in a high-rise building, to those who supplied it, those who installed it, and those who turned a deaf ear to concerns being raised about it afterwards. Sir Martin Moore-Bick, who led the inquiry, said early on in his presentation on the final report that when it comes to national government, that is where the seeds of this disaster were sown. Warnings were being made to government concerning the use of this form of flammable cladding going back as far as 1991, and that additional warnings had again been made to government in 2016, the year before the Grenfell tragedy took place. A culmination of decades of failure on their part, and so as much as it is tempting to lay into the government of Theresa May over this, on whose watch the fire began, the warnings first went unheeded by John Major's government and were ignored through Blair, then Brown, then Cameron, through to May. And it now falls to Keir Starmer to make the necessary legislative changes to make sure this never happens again. Yet, as the statement issued by the Justice for Grenfell campaigners afterwards made clear, I have little personal faith it'll happen, but I'll come on to that in more detail presently. In 1991 there was the Knowsley Heights Tower fire, which fortunately resulted in no casualties, but that was the warning. That was the first warning. There was another tower block, 11 stories high in this instance, and on this occasion in Merseyside, where the fire was able to spread because of the air gap between the walls and the flammable cladding used to screen the outside of the building. That the warnings were not heeded, that the dangers of this form of cladding were not taken on board, obvious as they seem to us now, obvious as surely they were at the time following investigation for use in high-rise construction. Amendments should have been made to the statutory guidance on construction of external walls, yet they weren't. Not in 1991, not in the run-up to the 2017 Grenfell disaster, all those years in between. And they have to be made now. There is no longer any excusing it. It is a sad statement of fact. It has taken the loss of human life to even get to this point where we're having this conversation about it again. But the report wouldn't be the length it is if it were as simple as just blaming the government. But given the relative simplicity in making what amounts to a small but incredibly meaningful piece of legislation, the inexcusability of not having done this by now won't be easily forgiven by numerous governments, nor will excuses to not act going forwards on that be accepted either, given government officials dismissing concerns over fire safety is one leading cause of blame identified in the inquiry. Ball in Starmer's court as that now is to not continue that trend. But the list of those at fault is lengthy, and so much evidence applies to some that entire parts of the final report are given over to it. Yes, the government were at fault, with regulations relating to refurbishment of high-rise buildings fatally inadequate, but so were the building and cladding companies who were systemically dishonest in their actions in supplying and promoting the offending materials when the risks about them were known. Sir Martin Moore-Bick made a point of listing all of those bearing blame in the lead up to the fire. There is, of course, the government for reasons already mentioned. There is also the Tenant Management Association, or TMO, who were meant to listen to tenants and address concerns as raised, and clearly they didn't. There is the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea itself, the administrative local council, the local government. One example of their fault in what appears to be an ongoing issue still with them comes from testimony of a fire engineer who joined RBKC after the fire and then quit just 7 months later, who said some of those flats in the borough have actually been made more dangerous since by the apparent safety works that have been done elsewhere, and that the racism on show there, the engineer himself being black, was horrendous, and if he didn't call it out, he wouldn't have been able to look his own children in the eye. How does that relate to Grenfell, though? Former MP for the area, Emma Dent-Code, long campaigner on Grenfell and the tragedy and changes needing to be made, spelt that out in a tweet, sharing that very article, saying, "This overnight story in the Times makes my blood run cold. Former RBKC fire engineer says some flats made more dangerous by safety works. Meanwhile, accuses the former mayor of RBKC of shocking racism. The two are connected." Blame was also attributed to the manufacturers and suppliers of the building materials used in the refurbishment, the likes of Kingspan and Arconic, knowing they were unsuitable, dishonest in their supplying of them. Blame extends further in that line of thinking to those certifying the materials as safe to use, those who signed off on them still being used as suitable to be used on a high-rise building. Blame was laid at the feet of the architect, of the principal contractor employed to install the cladding, and the subcontractors connected with this part of the refurbishment as well. Moore-Bick going so far in his presentation this morning to name some of those companies involved, such as Harley Kirk and Wall and their successor over that, Harley Facades. Blame must also be levied at the consultants at that time, and why warnings flagged up by the then fire engineer went unheeded. The entire refurbishment has to have been signed off by the local authority building control. Blame lies with them as well. Why did they sign off on it when clearly unsuitable cladding had been used? And the London Fire Brigade has had the finger of blame pointed at them in this inquiry as well. Every single death was avoidable. That was the statement Martin Moore-Bick made. Every single death happened because of incompetence, dishonesty and greed. And there has to be a reckoning for the people involved along that line. 72 people died. 18 of them were children, the youngest just 6 months old. But justice will still be some time away yet. Still, at least that process can now finally begin, though. Speaking of justice, though, if the view of anyone in light of the completion of this investigation and inquiry matters, it is those of the families of those who lost their lives. Grenfell United issued a statement of their own following the release of this morning's report, saying, "Today marks the conclusion of a painful 6 years listening to the evidence of the deaths of 54 adults and 18 children, our loved ones, neighbours and friends. It is a significant chapter in the journey to truth, justice and change, but justice has not been delivered. The inquiry report reveals that whenever there is a clash between corporate interest and public safety, governments have done everything they can to avoid their responsibilities to keep people safe. The system isn't broken, it was built this way. It speaks to a lack of competence, understanding, and a fundamental failure to perform the most basic duties of care. The recommendations published today are basic safety principles that should already exist, highlighting how the government's roles, duties, and obligations have been hollowed out by privatisation. Where voids were created as the government outsourced their duties, Kingspan, Celotex, and Arconic filled the gaps with substandard and combustible materials. They were allowed to manipulate the testing regimes, fraudulently and knowingly marketing their products as safe. Sir Martin Moore-Bick has laid bare his mistrust in the building industry. No single publication like approved document B should be subsequently be used as a means to regulate fire safety and to keep the public safe. The government knew this was no way to regulate. It was there to be exploited. Our lawyers told the inquiry that the corporate core participants, Arconic, Kingspan and Celotex, were little better than crooks and killers. The report makes clear that this statement is entirely true. We were failed in most cases by incompetence and in many cases by calculated dishonesty and greed. The duty of government should be to safeguard life while protecting us from corporate greed. But for too long they have aided corporations, facilitating them to profit and dictate regulation. It is a damning indictment of this country that amateurs like Carl Stokes and Ben Martin can pose as experts, putting countless lives at risk and taking the lives of our loved ones. There's a reading of the inquiry hiding in plain sight that speaks to both the damage done to Grenfell Tower and the wider damage done to Britain. It's a serious problem for the whole country when governments invite corporations to write their own rules. The government must now exert control over the sector to prevent further dismantling of public safety, which used to be understood as its primary job, not aiding and abetting crooks and killers. To prevent a future Grenfell, the government needs to create something that doesn't exist, a government with the power and ability to separate itself from the construction industry and corporate lobbying, putting people before profit. Over and above all, the judge concludes what we already know, that every single loss of life was avoidable. We expect this government to break old habits and implement all of the recommendations made by Sir Martin Moore-bick from the inquiry report without further delay, because the time to address this is already 3 decades too late. We are calling on the government to ban Arconic, Kingspan, Celotex and Ryden from central or local government procurement processes, and finally start acting in the British public's interest. We have an expectation that the Met Police and the CPS ensure that those who are truly responsible are held to account and brought to justice. We must never forget that at the heart of the inquiry report is the fact that 72 people lost their lives. In no uncertain terms is that directly addressed to Keir Starmer now, to make those changes in government, and whether or not he will, well, that will remain to be seen, won't it? Regular viewers can well imagine what I'd perhaps like to say on that at this point, given we're talking about reversing privatisation and saying no to corporate lobbying. But this isn't the video to do that. It just doesn't feel appropriate, doesn't feel right to not leave it with the words of the families of those who lost their lives in the tower ringing in your ears. Their message far more important than anything I might like to add about Starmer. For his part, he's issued an apology on behalf of the British state that the country failed them, were his words. But the reality is government did. Successive governments did. And the knock-on effect went from there. Apologies are one thing. The families want action now, so more deeds and less words now. Solidarity to everyone affected by this tragedy. Today, you've got vindication for your families. Next, hopefully, will come justice for them, and the legislative changes needed to finally make sure this can never happen again. But equally, there are still far too many buildings with this cladding still on them around the country, and that's got to change, and change quickly too. Not only was the cladding used on Grenfell Tower flammable, but it was also, as it turns out, carcinogenic when burned, and those living with the effects of that are the very people who risked their lives on that night to save others back in 2017. Get the details of that story in this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.